Picture this. It's 1810. Somewhere in what we now call Montana, John Colter is running for his life, naked. His feet are bleeding, thorns are tearing his flesh to ribbons, and behind him, maybe a quarter-mile back, maybe less, Blackfeet warriors are hunting him like he's nothing more than a wounded elk. Now, John Colter wasn't just anybody. This was a man who'd walked with Lewis and Clark. He'd seen the Pacific Ocean when most Americans thought the continent ended at the Mississippi. He'd discovered what we now call Yellowstone, though when he told people about boiling mud and water shooting 300 feet into the air, they called it Colter's Hell and figured the mountains had driven him mad. But here's the thing that gets me about this moment. As Colter crashes through that wilderness, bleeding and desperate, he's not just running from death, he's running towards something else entirely. Something that had never existed before in human history. See, Colter makes it to a river, plunges in. The water's so cold it stops your heart, but he forces himself under a pile of driftwood, and there he waits, breathing through a hollow reed like some kind of human beaver, while Blackfeet warriors probe the water with their lances. Their weapons are stabbing down just inches from his face. Inches. Think about that for a second. Really think about it. Here's a man who's learned to breathe underwater, to think like prey, to survive in a world that wants to kill him in about 50 different ways before breakfast. John Colter, farmer's son from Virginia, has become something new, something that didn't have a name yet. He was becoming a mountain man. Now, I need you to understand, this wasn't some romantic transformation. This wasn't noble savages and communion with nature. This was desperation meeting opportunity in the most violent classroom on earth. Because while Colter was learning to hide under driftwood, something was happening back in Street Louis that would change everything. Manuel Lisa had a problem. See, Lisa was what you might call an entrepreneur, though that's putting it politely. He'd formed the Missouri Fur Company, and he had his eyes fixed on one thing: beaver pelts. Beautiful waterproof beaver pelts that were worth their weight in silver back east. The problem was getting them. The British had the Hudson's Bay Company locked up tight in the north. The Spanish controlled everything south of the Arkansas River. But there was this middle ground, this vast, unmapped territory, full of streams that nobody had trapped. Nobody except the Indians, and they weren't exactly running a retail operation. Lisa needed men. Lots of them. Men willing to walk into country that had killed every white expedition that tried it. Men willing to live like Indians, think like Indians, but bring back pelts for white profits. So he did something brilliant and terrible. He offered credit. Picture yourself as an 18-year-old farm boy in 1820. Maybe you're in Kentucky, maybe Pennsylvania. Your father's got 6 sons and 160 acres. Do the math. There's not enough land to go around. You can stay and work your brother's farm for the rest of your life, or you can walk into Manuel Lisa's office in Street Louis and walk out with everything you need to make your fortune. A Hawken rifle, that's $50. $50 when a laborer makes maybe $1 a day if he's lucky. 12 steel traps, another 60. Powder, lead, blankets, coffee, sugar, salt. Add it all up, and you're looking at $200 before you've caught your first beaver. $200. That's more money than most of these kids had seen in their entire lives. But Lisa's not asking for cash. He's asking for pelts. $6 per pelt, and a good trapper might take 300 beaver in a season. Do that math and you're looking at $1,800. Minus expenses, minus Lisa's cut, minus the cost of supplies for next season. But still, you might walk out of the mountains with more money than your father made in 5 years. If you walked out at all. They came from everywhere. Ashley's 100 in 1822. That's what they called. William Ashley's first big expedition included farm boys from Missouri who'd never seen a mountain, veterans of the War of 1812 who couldn't settle down, clerks from New York who thought adventure meant something different than dysentery and frostbite. There were Europeans, too. French voyageurs who knew rivers like roads, Germans fleeing military conscription. At least 2 veterans of Napoleon's armies. He imagined that conversation around a campfire. So, Pierre, ever been cold before? Well, there was this winter in Russia. What united them wasn't background. It was desperation or dreams. sometimes both. And here's where the real transformation begins. Because these men, boys really, most of them, they had to learn everything. I mean everything. How to make moccasins from brain-tanned deer hide because leather boots rotted in the mountains within weeks. How to brew willow bark tea when the fever hit, because it would hit. How to read weather in the way marmots behaved, because weather could kill you deader than any Blackfoot warrior. They learned to sleep with one ear open and both eyes ready. They learned that coffee was a luxury you drank maybe twice a year. They learned that tobacco was currency, and whiskey was medicine, and horses were wealth itself. But most of all, they learned to adopt Indian ways. Not because they went native, though some did. Not because they loved Indian culture, though some came to. They adopted Indian ways because Indian ways worked. Wool clothing? Forget it. Wool got wet and stayed wet and froze solid in winter. Buckskin got softer with wear. Indian moccasins let you feel the ground, let you move silent as smoke. Indian methods of preserving meat meant that the difference between eating and starving. The transformation went deeper than clothing. These men learned to think in Crow when they trapped Crow country, to dream in landscape instead of language, to measure wealth in horses instead of coins, distance in days instead of miles, time in seasons instead of hours. Jim Bridger was 17 when he answered Ashley's advertisement. 17 years old, apprentice blacksmith from Virginia. Within 5 years he could navigate by stars, track a deer through rock country, and speak 6 Indian languages well enough to negotiate treaties. The Crow called him Blanket Chief and trusted him with their lives. The Blackfeet called him Blanket Chief too, but they meant to take his scalp. Kit Carson was barely 16, 5 feet 6 inches of Missouri farm boy who looked like he couldn't hurt a fly. By 20, he'd killed his first man and married his first Indian wife. Small and soft-spoken, he had a gift for languages and an even better gift for staying alive in situations that killed bigger, stronger men. Hugh Glass was older, maybe 40, and he brought something different to the mountains. Glass had been a sailor, had seen the world beyond America's borders. He understood that civilization was just one option among many, not necessarily the best option. When a grizzly bear tore him open in 1823, literally tore him open, folks, ribs showing, guts hanging out, Glass crawled 200 miles to Fort Kiowa. 200 miles. Crawling. Why? Because he'd learned something the mountains teach every man who survives them. You can endure anything if the alternative is dying. But here's what really gets me about these transformations. These weren't just individual changes. These men were creating something entirely new, a culture that existed nowhere else on Earth. Part white, part Indian, part something that had never existed before. They developed their own language. Wah! For surprise or excitement. That's some for very much so. Medicine for anything sacred, powerful, or unexplainable. Heap big for important things. A mixture of English, French, Spanish, and a dozen Indian languages, all rolled into something that worked when words mattered less than speed. They developed their own laws too. Partners shared everything: food, warmth, danger, death. If your partner died, you buried him proper if possible, paid his debts if he had any, and found his woman if he'd left one behind. You didn't abandon a wounded man unless he ordered you to. You didn't steal another man's traps or his woman or his horse unless you were ready to kill him for it. And they developed their own relationship with violence that was unlike anything in civilized society. Violence wasn't something that happened to them. It was a tool, like an axe or a rifle, something to be used precisely and without hesitation when the situation called for it. Because make no mistake, the mountains were trying to kill these men every single day. Grizzly bears that weighed 800 pounds and could run 30 miles per hour uphill. Winters that dropped to 40 below zero and lasted 6 months. Rivers that looked fordable until the currents swept you into rapids that turned grown men into broken dolls. And then there were the human dangers. The Blackfeet, who had decided that white trappers were enemies to be killed on sight. Mexican patrols who shot first and asked questions later. British trappers from the Hudson's Bay Company, who would cheerfully lead you into ambush if it meant controlling one more stream. But somehow, and this is the miracle of it, somehow these farm boys and city clerks not only survived, but thrived. They learned to read sign like books, to move through hostile country like ghosts, to live for months with no human contact except maybe their partner, if they were lucky enough to have one who hadn't died or deserted. They became something that had never existed before and would never exist again. Not quite white anymore because civilization had become foreign to them. Not Indian, because they carried different dreams and different gods. They were creatures of the frontier itself, the living, breathing edge, where known met unknown, and men found out what they were really made of. By 1825, when the first great rendezvous exploded into existence at Henry's Fork, there were maybe 3,000 of these creatures scattered across the western mountains. 3,000 men who'd learned to live like Indians, fight like demons, and trap like their lives depended on it. Which, of course, they did. But here's the question that haunts me. What did this transformation cost? Because nothing this profound comes free. These men gained skills and knowledge and freedoms that civilized folks couldn't even imagine. But they paid a price too. A price in blood and loneliness, and watching partners die in ways that would give you nightmares. They paid in families left behind, in children who grew up without fathers, in women who waited for men who never came home. They paid in minds stretched to the breaking point by isolation and violence and beauty so overwhelming it hurt to look at. And they paid in knowing, always knowing, that what they'd found couldn't last, that civilization would follow them eventually, that the streams full of beaver would be trapped out, the buffalo herds slaughtered, the Indian tribes destroyed or confined to reservations. They were creating their own destruction, pelt by pelt, map by map, trail by trail. But in 1825, at that first great rendezvous, with 1,000 souls gathered where months before only eagles had flown, well, that reckoning was still years away. For now, there was only the immediate miracle of it. Men who'd been transformed by the wilderness, gathering to trade their furs and tell their tales and prove to themselves that they'd survived another year in the most dangerous place on earth. What happened at those rendezvous, and the madness and the violence and the joy of it, well, that's a story for next time. But I want you to remember John Colter, breathing through that hollow reed while Blackfeet warriors probed the water inches from his face. Because that moment, that perfect, terrible moment of transformation, Teasel, that's where it all began. With desperate men learning to become something new, something wild, something that couldn't survive in civilization but thrived in the wilderness. The mountain men were born in moments like that, in terror and adaptation and the absolute refusal to die. And once they were born, there was no going back. Number 1825, Henry's Fork of the Green River. Middle of absolutely nowhere by any civilized standard, but for 2 weeks in July, it became the most important place in North America. Picture it, and I mean really picture it. You're standing on a rise overlooking the valley, and spread out below you is something that shouldn't exist. 1,000 people where 6 months ago there was nothing but grass and wind. Tepees and canvas tents stretching along the river like some impossible carnival. Smoke rising from 100 cook fires. The sound of men laughing, arguing, singing, fighting, all in a dozen different languages. This is Rendezvous, and it's about to change everything. See, William Ashley had figured out something brilliant. Instead of building permanent trading posts, which the Indians could attack and the weather could destroy, why not create a traveling marketplace? Bring the supplies to the trappers instead of making them come to civilization. But Ashley didn't just solve a logistics problem. He created something that had never existed in human history. A meeting ground where mountain men, Indians, Mexican traders, and Eastern suppliers could gather as equals. For 2 weeks every summer, the normal rules didn't apply. Year, 21 years old and already bearing scars from a grizzly's claws across his back. 3 arrowheads buried too deep in his flesh to remove. He'd carry them to his grave. Bridger could tell you every stream between the Missouri River and the Pacific Ocean, could navigate by stars you'd never heard of. He could speak Crow and Shoshone and Blackfoot well enough to negotiate treaties or declare war. But put him in a Street Lewis drawing room and he'd be helpless as a newborn. That's what Rendezvous was for. It was the one place where mountain man's skills mattered more than civilization, where Hugh Glass, the man who'd crawled 200 miles with his guts hanging out, commanded more respect than any banker or politician. Kit Carson was there too. Small, quiet, soft-spoken Kit Carson, who looked like he couldn't hurt a fly. By 1825, Carson had already killed his first man. It happened at Taos, New Mexico. A French bully named Chouinard kept picking fights with Americans, figured little Kit would be easy prey. Carson challenged him to a duel on horseback, India B, pistols at full gallop. Chouinard missed. Carson didn't. That's the thing about these men. They looked like nothing special until the moment when everything depended on not missing. Then you found out what all those years in the mountains had really taught them. The rendezvous system worked like this. Ashley would load pack trains with everything mountain men needed: rifles, powder, lead, traps, blankets, coffee, sugar, tobacco, whiskey. Lots of whiskey. He'd travel from Street Louis to whatever valley had been chosen for that year's gathering, arriving just as the trappers came down from the high country with their year's catch. Then the trading began. And brother, what trading it was! A pelt worth $2 in Street Louis sold for $6 at Rendezvous. Fair enough. Ashley was taking all the risks of transport. But a pound of coffee that cost 15 cents in Street Louis? That'll be $3 at Rendezvous. Sugar? $4 a pound. A cup of whiskey watered down until it was barely stronger than beer? $2. The markup was somewhere around 2,000%, and the mountain men paid it gladly. Why? Because money meant nothing in the mountains. You couldn't eat coins. You couldn't load them in your rifle. You couldn't trade them to Crow warriors for horses. For 11 months out of the year, wealth was measured in how well your rifle shot, how warm your blankets were, how sharp your knife stayed. But for 2 weeks every summer, at Rendezvous, all that deferred gratification exploded into the wildest party on the continent. Men who'd lived on jerky and roots for months would spend $50 on a feast that lasted one night. Trappers who hadn't tasted sugar in a year would blow their entire season's earnings on coffee and cake, and all the luxuries they dreamed about during those long winter nights when the temperature dropped to 40 below, and the wind tried to freeze the breath in their lungs. And then there were the games, wrestling matches between men who'd learned to fight for their lives, horse races with stakes that could bankrupt a trapper or make him rich, shooting contests where reputations were won and lost with a single shot. These weren't civilized competitions. They were tests of the skills that kept men alive in country that wanted to kill them. The drinking was legendary. Whiskey at $2 a cup, but men would mortgage next year's hunt for the chance to get roaring drunk with companions they might never see again. Because that was the thing about the mountain man life. You never knew if your partner would come back from the next expedition. Winter could kill him. Grizzlies could kill him. Blackfeet could kill him. Disease could kill him. A dozen different kinds of accidents could leave him dead in some unmarked canyon, his bones picked clean by ravens. So when you had the chance to celebrate with your friends, you celebrated like it might be the last time, which it very well might be. The Indian presence at Rendezvous was crucial. Crow, Shoshone, Flathead, Nez Perce, E.D., the friendly tribes came to trade and socialize and sometimes to find husbands for their daughters. Because here's something civilization didn't understand. Many mountain men took Indian wives, and it wasn't just about loneliness. These marriages were business partnerships, political alliances, survival strategies. A Crow wife could tan hides better than any white woman. She could set up or break camp in minutes. She could track game, identify edible plants, treat wounds with herbs that actually worked. She could translate when you were negotiating with her tribe, warn you when her cousins were planning to steal your horses, hide you when enemy war parties were hunting scalps. Most importantly, she could keep you sane during those long winter months when isolation drove men mad, because it did drive them mad, regularly. The social rules at Rendezvous reflected these realities. A mountain man's Indian wife was treated with respect by other trappers, even if they wouldn't dream of treating an Indian woman that way back in the settlements. Children from these marriages, mixed-blood kids who spoke 3 languages and belonged fully to neither world, were welcomed and protected by the entire mountain man community. But Rendezvous wasn't all celebration and trade. It was also where the unwritten laws of the mountains were enforced. Remember I told you about partners sharing everything? about not abandoning wounded men, about burying your partner's bones and paying his debts. These weren't just nice ideas. They were survival laws backed by community justice. Hugh Glass proved that when he finally tracked down the two men who'd abandoned him after the grisly attack. John Fitzgerald and young Jim Bridger had taken his rifle and his personal effects and left him to die, figuring he was as good as dead anyway. Glass crawled 200 miles to Fort Kiowa, fueled by nothing but rage and an absolute refusal to die. When Glass finally confronted them, the whole Mountain Man community was watching. What would he do? What was justice when you'd been left to die? Glass forgave Bridger. The kid was only 19, had been following Fitzgerald's lead. But Fitzgerald? Glass took back his rifle and his personal effects, and then he did something more devastating than violence. He told everyone exactly what had happened, made sure every man in the mountains knew that John Fitzgerald would abandon his partner to save his own skin. In a world where your life depended on your partner's loyalty, that was a death sentence. Fitzgerald never found another partner, never trapped another season, slunk back to civilization with his reputation destroyed. That's how mountain justice worked. Swift, brutal, and absolute. The 25 rendezvous established patterns that would last for 15 years. Every summer, the gathering moved to a new location, sometimes Henry's Fork, sometimes Pierre's Hole, sometimes the valley of the Green River. The location changed, but the rhythm remained the same. Spring breakup freed the streams from ice, and the trappers headed for the high country. Summer was for trapping the mountain beaver in their prime coats. Fall brought the big hunt, beaver and other fur-bearers putting on winter coats. Winter was for survival, holed up in some protected valley, living off cached supplies and hoping the weather wouldn't kill you before spring. And then rendezvous, the payoff for a year of suffering. 2 weeks of civilization's luxuries and wilderness freedoms combined. But even in 1825, the smart money could see what was coming. The streams that had seemed inexhaustible were showing signs of strain. Beaver populations were declining. Competition was increasing. The British Hudson's Bay Company was systematically over-trapping American territory, creating fur deserts to starve out American trappers. And there were other problems. Political problems. Mexican territory offered some of the richest trapping, but it required dodging patrols and paying bribes and risking imprisonment or execution if you were caught. American territory was safer legally, but was getting trapped out faster. British territory was off limits, unless you wanted to start an international incident. Every decision balanced risk against reward, measured in pelts and blood. The Blackfeet remained the deadliest threat. Unlike other tribes who might trade with mountain men one season and fight them the next, the Blackfeet had decided that white trappers were enemies to be killed on sight. Period. No exceptions. No negotiations. They were good at it too. Patient, skilled, utterly ruthless. They'd follow a trapper for days, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They'd set ambushes at river crossings, knowing trappers had to follow the water. They'd attack camps in pre-dawn darkness when men were sluggish with sleep, and they took trophies. Scalps, yes, but also fingers, ears, personal items that they'd display to intimidate other trappers. The psychological warfare was as effective as the physical attacks. Smart trappers learned to read Blackfoot sign like a language of death. The way grass was bent, scratches on bark, horse droppings that were too fresh or arranged too carefully. Silence, where there should be birdsong. The behavior of game animals who'd been spooked by human presence. Your life depended on noticing details that civilized men would never see. By the late 1820s, the rendezvous system was hitting its stride. The annual gatherings grew larger and wilder. More traders meant more competition, which meant better prices for trappers, sometimes. It also meant more temptation to blow your earnings on luxuries that seemed impossibly precious after a year in the wilderness. But, underneath the celebration, the mathematics were turning ugly. Beaver populations couldn't sustain the harvest levels. Political tensions were increasing. And back in the settlements, fashion was starting to change. Silk hats were becoming popular. Silk hats didn't require beaver felt, but in 1825, none of that seemed to matter. What mattered was that for 2 weeks, every summer, men who'd learned to live like Indians and fight like demons could gather in the wilderness and prove to themselves that they'd survived another year in the most dangerous place on earth. The Kingdom of Rendezvous was born in that valley at Henry's Fork. For 15 years, it would reign over the western mountains, creating fortunes and destroying lives, forging legends and breaking men's souls. But first, it had to survive the violence that was coming, because 1832 was about to bring the bloodiest battle in fur trade history, and after that, nothing would ever be the same. Number 1832, Pierre's Hole, in what's now eastern Idaho, July 26th. The temperature's climbing toward 90 degrees, which makes it perfect weather for a rendezvous, and perfect weather for the bloodiest battle in fur trade history. It started with a chance encounter, maybe the kind of thing that happens 100 times in the mountains with no consequences, but this time, everything went wrong. Antoine Godin was riding ahead of the main rendezvous party when he spotted a band of Gros Ventre warriors. Now, the Gros Ventre weren't exactly friends of the Americans, but they weren't necessarily enemies either. Sometimes they traded. Sometimes they fought. Mostly they avoided each other. But Godin had history with the Gros Ventre. They'd killed his father years earlier, and in the mountains, that kind of debt didn't get forgiven or forgotten. The Gros Ventre chief rode forward with a peace sign, maybe looking to trade, maybe just trying to avoid trouble. Godin rode out to meet him, and for a moment it looked like this might end peacefully. Then Godin shot him dead. Now, here's where you need to understand how quickly things could spiral out of control in the mountains. Godin's shot wasn't just murder, it was a declaration of war against the entire Gros Ventre band, and they were ready for war. Within minutes, the Gros Ventre warriors had fortified themselves in a grove of willows and cottonwoods along the creek, natural fortress, excellent fields of fire, water for a siege. These weren't panicked Indians running in circles. These were professional warriors who knew exactly what they were doing. The mountain men and their Indian allies found themselves facing a disciplinary problem. About 60 Gros Ventre warriors, dug in, well-armed, and fighting for their lives. The trappers had superior numbers, DAB, maybe 200 men, but numbers don't mean much when the enemy holds the high ground and has good cover. What happened next was 11 hours of pure hell. William Sublette, the famous trader and expedition leader, took an arrow through the shoulder in the first exchange of fire. The iron point punched completely through his body, and that wound would pain him every day until he died years later. But Sublette kept fighting, because that's what you did in the mountains. You fought until you couldn't fight anymore, and then you fought some more. Robert Campbell, Sublette's partner, watched his Iroquois hunters get picked off one by one. These were men he'd worked with for years, professional trappers who'd come west from the Great Lakes. They knew forests, knew ambush tactics, knew how to move quietly through cover. Didn't matter. The Gros Ventre were fighting on their home ground, and they were very, very good at killing. By nightfall, Campbell's Iroquois were either dead or dying, and their screams echoed off the canyon walls through the night, because the Gros Ventre didn't just kill their enemies, they made examples of them. Torture was psychological warfare, designed to break the morale of anyone listening. It worked. The mathematics of violence in the mountains had changed. Time was, a fight between trappers and Indians might cost 1 or 2 lives on each side before somebody decided it wasn't worth continuing. Individual combat, individual deaths, individual decisions to retreat or negotiate. But Pierre's Hole was different. This was warfare. Each he fought, organized, sustained, fought to the finish. The Gros Ventre had decided they were all going to die anyway, so they might as well take as many enemies with them as possible. That kind of desperation is terrifying, and it's contagious. The mountain men found themselves fighting with a savagery that surprised even them. Men who'd lived peacefully alongside Indians for years were suddenly trying to kill every Gros Ventre warrior they could find. The usual rules of mountain warfare: take prisoners if possible, negotiate when you can, avoid unnecessary killing, all of that went out the window. By morning, the battlefield was littered with bodies from both sides. The Gros Ventre had made good on their promise. In a fee, they'd sold their lives as dearly as possible. But they were all dead, and the mountain men had learned something ugly about themselves. They could fight total war, and some of them liked it. The Battle of Pierre's Hole marked a turning point in mountain man culture. Before 1832, violence was usually personal and limited. After Pierre's Hole, it became systematic and ruthless. Take Jedediah Smith. Now, Smith was about as civilized as mountain men got, heaven time, carried a Bible, didn't drink, treated Indians with respect whenever possible. He'd already survived one grisly attack that tore off his scalp and mangled his ear so badly that he looked like a walking horror story. But Smith also led some of the most brutal expeditions in mountain man history. When Mojave warriors killed 10 of his men during a fly crossing of the Colorado River, Smith came back with reinforcements and killed every Mojave warrior he could find. When they killed 10 more of his men on a later expedition, Smith's response was even more savage. The survivors of Smith's final expedition told stories that would give you nightmares. Men eating their horses when the water ran out in the Mojave Desert, then eating their moccasins, then digging for roots like animals, their hands bleeding, their tongues swollen with thirst. And through it all, Smith kept pushing forward. Not because he was cruel, but because stopping meant dying. In the mountains, mercy was a luxury that could get you killed. The psychological weight of survival was becoming unbearable. Men who'd faced grizzlies and blizzards and hostile warriors without flinching were breaking down under the accumulated stress of years in the wilderness. Joe Meek, tough, competent Joe Meek, who could track a deer through rock country and speak half a dozen Indian languages, came back from one expedition and didn't speak for 3 months. Just sat by the fire, staring at nothing, jumping at every sound. When he finally did talk, all he'd say was, "I seen the elephant." That was mountain man slang for confronting death so closely that you never really recovered. Seeing the elephant meant you'd looked into the abyss, and the abyss had looked back. A lot of men saw the elephant in those days. Not all of them came back from the experience. But the real horror was still coming, because 1837 brought something worse than grizzlies, worse than Blackfeet, worse than starvation or freezing, or any of the familiar ways the mountains could kill you: smallpox. The epidemic started on a steamboat traveling up the Missouri River, the Street Peter, carrying supplies and passengers to the upper trading posts. Somebody on board was infected, probably didn't even know it yet, since smallpox takes days to show symptoms. By the time the boat reached Fort Union, the disease was spreading like invisible fire. Mountain men watched whole villages die, entire tribes wiped out in weeks. The Mandans, who had helped Lewis and Clark, who had traded peacefully with whites for decades, 30,000 people, reduced to fewer than 200, 30,000 to 200. Let that sink in. The trappers carried the disease in their blankets, their clothes, their bodies. They were unwitting angels of death, spreading destruction wherever they went. Some of them knew it and kept traveling anyway, because stopping meant dying alone in the wilderness. Others tried to help. Joe Meek found his Shoshone wife Mountain Lamb dying beside a stream, her beautiful face unrecognizable from the pustules, her mind lost to fever. He held her while she died, knowing he might be next, not caring. Dick Wooten came across a Crow village where every single person was dead. Men, women, children, old people, babies, all dead. The tepes were full of rotting corpses. Dogs were eating the bodies. The stench was unimaginable. Wooten burned the entire village. What else could you do? But here's the thing that haunts me about the smallpox epidemic. It didn't just kill Indians. It killed something in the mountain men too. These were men who'd learned to live alongside native peoples, who'd married Indian women, who'd been adopted into tribes and treated like family. And now they were watching those families die. Horrible, lingering deaths. Deaths they couldn't prevent, couldn't cure, couldn't even understand. Some mountain men went mad from the guilt. Others turned hard and bitter, deciding that Indians were doomed anyway, so it didn't matter what happened to them. A few, very few, tried to help, sharing medicine and food and comfort even when it put their own lives at risk. But the psychological damage was permanent. The mountains had always been dangerous, but they'd also been beautiful, a place where a man could find freedom and purpose, and maybe even happiness. After 1837, they were just dangerous. The fur trade was changing too. Competition was getting vicious. The Hudson's Bay Company was systematically overtrapping American streams, creating fur deserts to drive American trappers out of business. Mexican authorities were cracking down on illegal trapping in their territory. The best streams were getting trapped out faster than beaver populations could recover, and back in the settlements, something was happening that would destroy the entire industry. Fashion was changing. Silk hats were becoming popular. Silk hats that didn't require beaver felt. The price of beaver pelt started to drop. $6 became $4. $4 became $2. By 1840, prime beaver that had once sold for $6 was going for $1 if you could find a buyer at all. The mathematics were brutal and simple. When a pelt was worth $6, a trapper could make a living. When it dropped to $1, he couldn't even cover his expenses. But the mountain men kept trapping anyway. Most of them had been in the wilderness so long they didn't know how to live anywhere else. They'd learned to speak Crow and Shoshone better than English. They'd forgotten how to sleep in beds, how to eat with forks, how to make conversation with civilized people. The mountains had made them into something new, but that something couldn't survive in the world that was coming. The last great rendezvous was held in 1840 at Horse Creek. Maybe 400 people showed up, a fraction of the gatherings from the peak years. The trading was half-hearted, the celebration forced. Everyone knew it was ending. Jim Bridger was there, 36 years old and already going blind from decades of sun glare on snow. Kit Carson was there, small and quiet as always, but his soft voice carried stories that would chill your blood. Hugh Glass was there, the man who'd crawled 200 miles after the grizzly attack, still alive but looking like he'd been dead for years. They were ghosts haunting their own funeral, but they weren't quite dead yet. Because the California gold rush was coming, and suddenly there was demand for guides who knew the western trails, men who could lead wagon trains through hostile country, men who could read weather and sign and find water in the desert. The mountain men had one more act to play, but it would be their final performance, and it would cost them everything they'd fought to preserve. Number 1843, Colorado Territory. January. Bill Williams is drawing lots with his partners to see who dies first. Let that sink in for a moment. 4 men, trapped by a blizzard in the Colorado Rockies, starving, freezing, so desperate they've decided that one of them has to die so the others can live. And they're going to decide who dies by drawing lots. Like it's some kind of game. Williams draws the short straw. Or maybe he doesn't. Maybe he volunteers, figuring at 60 he's had a longer run than the young ones. The stories vary, and the men who survived weren't exactly eager to talk about it afterward. What we know for certain is this. They killed him before he was fully dead, carved flesh from his body while his heart was still beating, cooked it over a fire made from broken trap handles, ate it without salt or seasoning, because they'd run out of both weeks earlier, and when they were done, they drew lots again. This is what the mountains could do to men. This is how far civilization could fall when winter showed its teeth, and the game disappeared and the cached supplies ran out. But the cannibalism wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was the madness. Phantom Jack started talking to invisible companions sometime in the 1830s. He'd been alone too long, months at a time without human contact, nothing but his own voice, and the wind and the sound his traps made when they closed on something. By the end, Jack was holding full conversations with people who'd been dead for years. "Morning, Pete," he'd say to his long-dead partner. "Coffee's ready." And he'd pour 2 cups, though he was alone in the wilderness and had been for 8 months. The other mountain men found Jack's conversations reassuring, in a strange way. At least he was talking to somebody, even if that somebody wasn't there. It was the men who stopped talking altogether that really worried them. Black Harris swore he'd seen petrified forests, where the birds sang frozen songs. Trees turned to stone, he said, with stone birds in their stone branches, singing stone songs that rang like bells when the wind hit them just right. Sounds crazy, right? Except Harris was describing something real, the fossilized forests of Yellowstone, where ancient trees had been turned to stone by volcanic activity. The birds weren't petrified, of course, but in winter, when ice covered everything, maybe they looked that way to a man who'd been alone too long. The line between reality and madness was razor thin in the mountains. Men reported seeing cities of gold shimmering on distant peaks, valleys where summer never ended, where the grass was always green and the streams always ran warm, caves filled with the bones of giants, animals bigger than buffalo, with teeth like sabers. Some of these stories turned out to be true. The geysers and hot springs of Yellowstone, the dinosaur fossils of the Colorado Plateau, the mirages created by temperature inversions in the desert. But others were pure delusion, born from isolation and malnutrition, and the kind of loneliness that eats a man's soul from the inside out. Dick Wooten found his partner frozen upright against a tree one morning, eyes open, looking alert, rifle across his knees like he was still on guard duty. Wooten talked to him for 10 minutes before he realized the man was dead, had been dead for who knows how long, maybe days, maybe weeks. The cold had preserved him perfectly. No decay, no smell, just a dead man who looked like he might start talking at any moment. Wooten buried him as best he could, but the ground was frozen solid, ended up just piling rocks over the body and saying a few words. Then he took the man's rifle and ammunition and kept moving, because standing still meant dying. That's what winter could do in the mountains. Kill you so quietly you might not even notice. Hypothermia was like that. It made you stupid and confused before it killed you. Men would wander away from camp in the middle of blizzards, convinced they were heading for safety. They'd be found in the spring, frozen solid, sometimes just yards from shelter. The smart ones learned to recognize the signs. When you stopped shivering, you were in trouble. That meant your body was giving up the fight to stay warm. When you started feeling hot, when you wanted to take your clothes off in sub-zero weather, you were minutes away from death. But recognizing the signs and doing something about them were two different things. Because sometimes there was nothing you could do. Sometimes the fuel ran out and the food ran out, and all you could do was sit there and wait to see if you'd wake up in the morning. Liver-eating Johnson earned his name by tracking down Crow warriors and eating their livers raw. At least, that's what he claimed. Said he did it to avenge his wife's murder. Said he'd killed 300 Crow and eaten every single liver. The truth was probably different. Johnson's wife wasn't murdered. She died of pneumonia during a hard winter. And the liver-eating? That might have started as a survival thing, eating organ meat to prevent scurvy, and turned into a story that grew bigger with each telling. But Johnson believed his own story by the end, absolutely convinced he was a one-man war party, hunting Crow warriors across the Montana wilderness. The other mountain men went along with it, because Johnson was useful to have around. He could track anything, survive anywhere, and fight like a demon when he had to. Also, he was completely insane, and you don't argue with insane men who carry knives. The isolation was the hardest part. Months alone in the wilderness, talking to yourself, talking to your horse, talking to the rocks and trees because you needed to hear a voice, even if it was your own. Some men handled it better than others. The lucky ones had partners they could trust, men who'd share the burden of staying alive, staying alert, staying sane, partners who'd take turns staying awake at night, listening for the sounds that meant trouble, partners who'd talk through the long winter nights, telling the same stories over and over because familiar stories were a kind of anchor to reality. But partners died, got killed by grizzlies or Blackfeet or accidents or diseases, got lost in blizzards or swept away by rivers or just wandered off one day and never came back. The mountains were full of men who'd started with partners and ended up alone, and being alone in the wilderness was like being alone on another planet. No human voices, no human smells, no signs that your own species had ever existed. Just you and the vast indifference of nature, which didn't care if you lived or died, didn't even notice you were there. The mind could snap as easily as frozen leather. One day you're tracking elk through fresh snow, completely in control, master of your environment. The next day, you're howling at the moon and building shrines to dead partners and seeing signs and omens in every cloud formation. Mountain madness, they called it. And once it got its hooks in you, there was no going back. But here's the thing that really gets me. Even the mad ones were still functional, still dangerous, still capable of surviving in country that would kill sane men in days. Phantom Jack might have been talking to invisible companions, but he could still read sign like a book, still track game through terrain that looked empty to normal eyes. Black Harris might have been seeing petrified birds, but he never got lost, never walked into an ambush, never failed to find water in country where other men died of thirst. The mountains demanded skills that went deeper than rational thought, instincts honed by years of constant danger, knowledge stored in muscles and reflexes rather than conscious memory. The mad ones had all of that, plus something extra, a willingness to believe in things that sane men would dismiss. Sometimes that belief kept them alive. If you thought the rocks were trying to warn you about danger, you paid attention to details that rational men ignored. If you thought your dead partner was still giving you advice, you might make better decisions than men who relied on logic alone. The madness wasn't always a handicap. Sometimes it was an adaptation, but it came at a cost. These men were losing their humanity piece by piece, replacing human connections with delusions and fantasies. They were becoming something other than human, not animal, because animals aren't crazy, but something new. Something that belonged neither to civilization nor to the natural world. And they knew it. In their lucid moments, they knew exactly what they were becoming. That might have been the worst part, the clarity that came between episodes of madness, when they could see themselves objectively and understand what the mountains had cost them. Tom Fitzpatrick, one of the sanest and most successful mountain men, wrote in his journal, "I fear I am becoming something that would frighten civilized folks. Not because I am violent or cruel, but because I am no longer entirely human. I think in ways that would seem alien to my former self. I value things that have no value in the world I came from. I am afraid of comforts that once seemed essential." That was 1839. By 1845, Fitzpatrick, he was working for the US government, guiding wagon trains and negotiating treaties with Indians, but he never forgot what he'd written in that journal, never forgot the fear of becoming something other than human. And he wasn't wrong to be afraid, because the mountains had changed these men in ways that couldn't be undone. They'd learned to survive alone in the most hostile environment on the continent, but they'd paid for that knowledge with pieces of their souls. The winter of 1843 wasn't unusual. It was just another example of what happened every year to men who chose to live beyond the edge of civilization. Some survived, some didn't. Some kept their sanity, some lost it. All of them were changed by the experience in ways that marked them for life. But they were also running out of time. The California gold rush was coming, and with it, thousands of people who would see the wilderness as nothing more than an obstacle to overcome. The trails the mountain men had marked with their bones would become highways. The secret valleys would become settlements. The endless frontier would become a memory. And the men who'd learned to live alone in the wilderness would have to figure out how to live among people again, if they still could. 1840. The American Fur Company's ledgers told a story that no amount of courage or skill could change. Operating costs had tripled. Profits had fallen 90%. The price of beaver pelts had crashed from $6 to $1, and even at that price, buyers were hard to find. Silk hats had conquered fashion. Silk hats that didn't require beaver felt. Jim Bridger saw it coming. At 36, already going blind from decades of sun glare on snow, Bridger was smart enough to read the writing on the wall. But reading it and accepting it were two different things. Picture this. You've spent 20 years mapping every stream between the Missouri River and the Pacific Ocean. You know where the good beaver live, where the best campsites are, where the water runs sweet and the grass grows thick. You've got secret valleys that no white man has ever seen, places so beautiful they'd take your breath away. And now, you're supposed to sell that knowledge for $200 to guide wagon trains full of farmers and merchants and their families. People who look at your wilderness kingdom and see nothing but empty land waiting to be improved. That's what Bridger did in 1841. Started guiding wagon trains along the Oregon Trail at $200 per journey. Good money, steady work, safer than trapping. But watching those families head into his secret valleys felt like selling his own children. The Oregon Trail followed routes that mountain men had marked with their bones. Every landmark had a story, usually involving somebody's death. Scott's Bluff, named for Hiram Scott, a fur trader who died of disease and was buried there by his companions. Devil's Gate, ATE, where 5 trappers vanished without trace, probably killed by Crow war parties. Independence Rock, A.L.S., where travelers carved their names, not knowing they were writing over older marks left by men who died getting there. Kit Carson took government contracts too, guiding expeditions for John C. Fremont, the pathfinder who got credit for discovering routes that Carson had been using for 15 years. Carson didn't seem to mind. He was practical that way. If Fremont wanted to pay him to show him places Carson knew by heart, that was Fremont's business. But it must have stung. Reading newspaper accounts that praised Fremont's discoveries, while barely mentioning the small, quiet man who actually did the pathfinding. Carson could have walked from St. Louis to California, blindfolded, but history would remember Fremont as the explorer. That's how it always worked with mountain men. They did the real work, the exploring, the mapping, the dying, and other people got the credit. The California Gold Rush of 1849 provided the final insult. 49ers swarmed through territories that mountain men had kept secret for decades. Streams that had been carefully managed for beaver were destroyed by hydraulic mining. Sacred Indian gathering places became boomtowns with names like Hangtown and Murderer's Bar. Old Bill Williams guided gold seekers through the San Juan Mountains in the winter of 1848. It was a death march from the beginning. Williams was 64 years old, half mad from decades in the wilderness, leading tenderfoot prospectors through some of the most dangerous country on the continent in the middle of winter. Did Williams know he was guiding them to their deaths? Some people think so. Think he was settling accounts with the civilization that had destroyed his world. Others say he was just old and confused, his judgment finally failing after all those years. Either way, the result was the same. Williams died in those mountains, his body found months later, riddled with bullets. Whether the bullets came from angry survivors or hostile Utes, nobody knows for sure. Maybe it doesn't matter. Williams was already a ghost by then, a man who belonged to a world that no longer existed. The railroad surveys of the 1850s used mountain man guides to plot routes that would erase the wilderness forever. Tom Fitzpatrick, broken hand, Fitzpatrick, worked for the government, mapping railroad routes across territory he'd once trapped. Every mile of track he helped plan was another nail in the coffin of the world he'd known. Fitzpatrick died of pneumonia in Washington, D.C. in 1854, trying to negotiate treaties that he knew the government would break. He'd spent his final years watching the systematic destruction of everything he'd loved. The wilderness, the Indian tribes who'd been his allies, the way of life that had made him feel truly alive. But the mountain men weren't just victims of progress. They were also its agents. Every trail they blazed, every map they drew, every report they filed made it easier for civilization to follow. They were opening the door to their own destruction, and most of them knew it. The mathematics were brutal and inevitable. In 1820, maybe 3,000 mountain men scattered across the western wilderness. By 1850, the western wilderness was disappearing, carved up by territorial boundaries and railroad surveys and mining claims. The survivors found work where they could. Some became army scouts, hunting the very Indians who'd once been their allies. Others became town marshals, using their wilderness skills to keep order in rough mining camps and railroad towns. A few became showmen, performing their own lives for audiences who thought the Wild West was entertainment, but most just faded away, disappeared into the margins of civilization, broken down old men with stories nobody believed and skills nobody needed. Jim Bridger ended up on a farm in Missouri, his eyes finally defeated by decades of sun glare on snow. Blind, confined to 160 acres of tame prairie, he'd sit on his porch and listen to his daughter read him newspaper accounts of the Transcontinental Railroad crossing his beloved Green River. Each word was another nail in memory's coffin. Buffalo Bill Cody hired aging mountain men for his Wild West show at $10 a week. They'd perform twice daily for crowds who cheered their fakest moments and yawned at the truth. Carson's last years were spent reenacting his own adventures for tourists who thought the real West was whatever they saw on stage. The mountain men had become caricatures of themselves, performing parodies of their former lives for people who'd never understand what they'd really accomplished or what they'd really lost. John Jeremiah Johnston sold his rifle for whiskey money and died in a veteran's home, claiming to the end that he'd eaten human livers. The nurses thought he was just another crazy old man with delusions of grandeur. They had no way of knowing that his stories, even the wildest ones, might actually be true. Joe Meek became Oregon's first federal marshal, but he drank himself senseless trying to forget that he'd led the wagon trains that destroyed his former world. His stories grew wilder with each telling, fighting 50 Blackfeet single-handed, riding buffalo through blizzards, marrying the daughter of a Crow chief who turned into a mountain spirit. Listeners bought him drinks to hear more lies, never knowing that the true stories were actually worse. The real Crow wife had died of measles he'd carried from the settlements. The 50 Blackfeet had actually been 5, and they'd killed his best friend, while Meek hid in the river willows, paralyzed with terror. Store clothes never fit right on bodies that had been shaped by buckskin. Town food tasted like ash to mouths that remembered buffalo hump and beaver tail. These ghosts wandered between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, their very existence a reminder of freedoms that had been lost forever. The transformation was complete, but it had gone in reverse. Men who'd learned to live like Indians were forced to live like failed white men. Skills that had kept them alive in the wilderness were useless in civilization. Knowledge that had been precious beyond measure was suddenly worthless. They were living fossils, specimens of an extinct species, objects of curiosity rather than respect. But here's what gets me about this whole tragedy. It didn't have to happen this way. The mountain men weren't just victims of historical inevitability. They were active participants in their own destruction, and some of them knew exactly what they were doing. Every government contract they signed, every wagon train they guided, every map they drew for railroad surveyors, they were building the infrastructure that would destroy their world. They were teaching civilization how to conquer the wilderness that had been their kingdom, and they did it for money, for steady wages and regular meals, and the promise of security in their old age. The same men who'd risked everything for the chance to live free in the mountains sold that freedom for the comfort of knowing where their next meal was coming from. Maybe that makes them human. Maybe it just makes them practical. Or maybe it makes them traitors to everything they'd once believed in. I can't decide which interpretation is worse. By 1860, the transformation was nearly complete. The western wilderness existed only in memory and in the stories of old men who smelled like whiskey and loneliness. The trails were highways, the secret valleys were settlements, the endless frontier was a grid of property lines and political boundaries. And somewhere in Missouri, Jim Bridger sat blind on his porch, listening to his daughter read about the modern world that had grown up over the bones of his former kingdom. The mountain men were still alive, technically, but the world that had made them had died years earlier, and they were just ghosts haunting its corpse. Number 1860. Jim Bridger sits on a porch in Westport, Missouri, his once keen eyes finally defeated by decades of snow glare and alkali dust. The man who'd mapped every stream from the Yellowstone to the Colorado River can't see his own front yard now. His daughter Mary reads him the newspaper every morning. Today it's about the Transcontinental Railroad, how the crews are making good progress across Wyoming territory, following the routes that Bridger had scouted for the government surveys. Every word is a knife in his memory. "They crossed the Green River yesterday, Papa," Mary reads. "The engineers say it's some of the most beautiful country they've ever seen." Bridger doesn't answer, can't answer, because he knows that country like he knows his own heartbeat, every bend in the river, every good camping spot, every place where the beaver used to build their dams before the trappers cleaned them out. He'd discovered South Pass, the gateway through the Rockies that every wagon train used. He'd found the Great Salt Lake and tasted its water, wondering if it connected to the Pacific Ocean. He'd seen the geysers and hot springs of Yellowstone when it was still cold as hell, a place so impossible that people thought the stories were lies. Now, strangers were crossing his country on iron rails, turning a 3-month journey into a 3-day trip. The wilderness that had nearly killed him 100 times was becoming a tourist destination. This is what victory looked like for mountain men. Survival, but at the cost of everything that had made survival worthwhile. Buffalo Bill Cody understood the market value of nostalgia. By the 1880s, his Wild West show was packing audiences across America and Europe, giving city folks a taste of the frontier they'd helped destroy. And Cody was smart enough to hire the real thing, aging mountain men who'd perform their own lives twice daily for $10 a week. Picture it. Kit Carson, the man who'd guided 3 major expeditions across the continent, reenacting his adventures for crowds who thought the real West was whatever they saw on stage. Carson performing a sanitized version of his life, leaving out the parts about eating his own moccasins and watching Indian wives die of diseases he'd carried from the settlements. The audiences loved it, cheered when Kit Carson shot blanks at actors dressed as Indians, applauded when he rescued white women from savage captors. Never mind that the real Carson had married Indian women, had been adopted by tribes, had friends and allies among the very people the show portrayed as monsters. Carson died in 1868, probably glad to escape the circus his life had become. His last words were reportedly, "Wish I was back in the mountains." But even that might be myth. One more story added to the legend that had buried the man. The myth-making had started before the last mountain man died. Dime novels transformed them into superhuman heroes who never felt cold, never missed a shot, never wept for loneliness or went mad from isolation. Eastern writers who'd never been west of Philadelphia created a fantasy frontier populated by noble savages and natural philosophers who spoke in profound metaphors about the relationship between man and wilderness. Hollywood would add its own layers decades later: comedic sidekicks, wise mentors, tragic heroes doomed by the march of civilization. Each generation of storytellers moved further from the truth, until the mountain men became symbols rather than people, myths rather than history. But the real artifacts tell a different story. Jim Bridger's telescope, displayed in a Wyoming museum, shows the wear of constant use. The brass is worn smooth, where his fingers gripped it night after night, scanning the horizon for signs of danger. The lens is scratched from years of wind-blown sand and alkali dust. Kit Carson's journal, barely legible even when it was new, desperately tries to record beauty that words couldn't capture. The mountains here are the most beautiful I ever saw. They seem to reach up and touch the sky. I wish I could make people understand what it feels like to see sunrise from up there, but I don't have the words. Steel traps still holding beaver bones, testament to skills that died with the men who wielded them. These weren't romantic artifacts. They were tools of a brutal trade that required precise knowledge and perfect timing, and the willingness to spend months alone in country that could kill you in a dozen different ways. The truth lies in those artifacts, not in the stories. The mountain men were neither noble savages nor natural philosophers. They were desperate, skillful, often half-mad survivors who found freedom in the most dangerous place on earth and paid for it with pieces of their souls. Their greatest tragedy wasn't death. Death was common in the mountains, expected, almost welcomed when it came clean. Their greatest tragedy was living long enough to be transformed into symbols of American freedom by the very civilization that had destroyed their world. What remains is the question they embodied. What price is worth paying for absolute freedom? They paid in frostbitten fingers, sawed off with hunting knives when gangrene set in. They paid in partners buried in unmarked graves, their bones scattered by wolves because the ground was too frozen to dig proper holes. They paid in native families destroyed by diseases they carried from the settlements, smallpox and measles, and cholera that swept through tribes like invisible fire. They paid in minds shattered by isolation, by violence, by beauty so overwhelming it hurt to look at. They paid in the certain knowledge that their way of life couldn't last, that every trail they blazed brought civilization closer to their secret kingdoms. And what did they gain? Moments of transcendence that no civilized person could understand. Sunrise over valleys that no white man had ever seen, so beautiful it made you weep. Brotherhood deeper than blood with men who'd share their last bite of food or their last cartridge without being asked. Knowledge of secrets the mountains whispered only to those who'd paid in suffering, where the good water ran, where the game trails led, how to read weather in the behavior of ravens. They gained the experience of absolute freedom, the knowledge that they could survive anywhere, endure anything, overcome any obstacle through skill and courage and the refusal to quit. They gained stories that would outlive them, even if the stories got twisted and romanticized beyond recognition. But here's the question that haunts me. Was the bargain worth it? I don't know. I honestly don't know. The mountain men themselves couldn't agree. Some died convinced they'd lived the only life worth living, while others spent their final years trying to forget what they'd seen and done in the wilderness. Maybe the answer doesn't matter. maybe the question itself is the point. Because the mountain men represent something essential about the American character, the willingness to risk everything for the chance to live free, even if that freedom comes at a cost that might be too high to pay. They were the last Americans who could disappear into the wilderness and reinvent themselves completely. The last generation that could walk away from civilization and create something entirely new. The last men who measured wealth in horses rather than dollars, distance in days rather than miles, time in seasons rather than schedules. When they died, that possibility died with them. The frontier closed, the wilderness was conquered, the endless possibilities narrowed to the choices available within civilization's boundaries. Modern America is built on the routes they mapped, the passes they discovered, the treaties they negotiated. Every interstate highway follows trails marked with their bones. Every national park preserves wilderness they explored when it was still truly wild. Every Western movie echoes stories they told around campfires that went cold a century ago, but we've forgotten what they really were. We remember them as symbols, freedom fighters, noble savages, tragic heroes, instead of what they actually were, desperate, skillful survivors who found meaning in a life that was brutal and beautiful and brief. Their legacy isn't the myths we've built around them. Their legacy is the proof that human beings can adapt to anything, survive anywhere, endure any hardship if they're willing to pay the price. They proved that freedom exists, that it's possible to live outside civilization's rules, that individual courage and skill can overcome any obstacle. They also proved that such freedom comes at a cost that might destroy you, that absolute independence requires absolute responsibility, that living beyond society's protection means accepting society's consequences. The mountain men asked the ultimate American question: what are you willing to risk for the chance to be completely free? They risked everything: comfort, safety, sanity, humanity itself, and for a few brief decades, they found an answer that worked. Then the world changed, and their answer stopped working, and they became ghosts, haunting the edges of a civilization that no longer had room for men like them. But the question remains. It will always remain, because as long as there are Americans, there will be people who wonder what life would be like beyond the boundaries, outside the rules, free from everything except the consequences of their own choices. The mountain men found out, they paid the price, learned the lessons, and left us their stories as a warning and an inspiration. Whether we're brave enough to understand either message remains to be seen. Today, Interstate 80 follows the Platte River Road that mountain men carved with their lives. Every mile of asphalt covers ground that Jim Bridger walked, streams that Hugh Glass crawled beside, valleys where Kit Carson made his camps. The modern traveler driving from Nebraska to Wyoming at 70 miles per hour is following routes mapped by men who measured the same distance in months of suffering. But here's what gets me. Those drivers have no idea they're traveling through a graveyard. Every exit ramp, every rest stop, every scenic overlook exists because broken men in buckskins figured out where the water was sweet, where the grass grew thick, where you could cross a river without drowning. NASA uses their route-finding techniques to understand how humans explore unknown territories. Modern GPS systems follow waypoints they established with nothing but instinct and the stars. Their geographic legacy spans 8 states and 10,000 place names. Bridger's Ferry, Carson City, Coulter Bay, Tfue Chi. Fragments of men's names scattered across the map like pieces of their souls. But the real legacy isn't the names on road signs. It's the knowledge encoded in every mountain trail, every river crossing, every pass through seemingly impassable peaks. Modern psychological studies of isolation reference mountain man journals to understand how minds fracture under extreme conditions. Researchers studying Antarctic exploration, deep space missions, and solo sailing expeditions quote Hugh Glass and Joe Meek and Phantom Jack, trying to understand how human consciousness adapts to absolute solitude. The mountain men became involuntary test subjects in humanity's greatest experiment. How much can a person endure and still remain human? Some survived the test, others didn't, but all of them contributed data that scientists are still analyzing today. Their multicultural marriages created bloodlines that still bridge native and white worlds, though many descendants know nothing of their origins. Crow families with Irish surnames, Shoshone grandchildren who carry Scottish DNA, mixed blood communities scattered across the West, preserving languages and traditions that would have disappeared otherwise. These genetic legacies tell a story that the history books usually skip. The mountain men weren't just exploring the wilderness, they were creating new kinds of Americans. People who belonged fully to neither white nor Indian culture but carried the best of both. But the myth-making began before the last mountain man died, and it's the myths that most people remember. Dime novels in the 1870s transformed them into superhuman heroes who never felt cold, never missed a shot, never wept from loneliness or went mad from mercury poisoning while treating syphilis. Eastern writers who'd never been west of the Mississippi created a fantasy frontier where noble savages and natural posse philosophers spoke in profound metaphors about man's relationship with nature. The real mountain men would have laughed at those stories, or maybe wept, because the truth was simultaneously more mundane and more extraordinary than any fiction. Mundane. They got sick. They got scared. They made mistakes that got their partners killed. They argued over supplies, cheated at cards, and sometimes abandoned wounded companions to save their own lives. Extraordinary. They survived in conditions that would kill modern survivalists in days. They adapted to cultures completely foreign to their upbringing. They found beauty in landscapes so harsh that most people would see only desolation. Hollywood added its own layers of mythology. The mountain man as comedic sidekick, spouting folksy wisdom and providing comic relief. The mountain man as tragic hero, doomed by the march of civilization but accepting his fate with noble resignation. The mountain man as wise mentor, teaching younger men the secrets of wilderness survival. All of these portrayals miss the essential truth. The mountain men were ordinary people who did extraordinary things because the alternative was dying. They weren't inherently heroic. They were adaptable. They didn't seek adventure. They sought profit. They didn't commune with nature. They fought it for survival, every single day. But maybe that makes their achievements more remarkable, not less. Because if they were just ordinary people, then their story suggests that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. The artifacts in museums tell a more honest story than the movies. Jim Bridger's rifle, worn smooth from decades of use. The barrel shows scratches from countless cleanings. The stock bears marks where he carved notches, probably counting something, though nobody knows what. Kit Carson's moccasins, preserved in a Colorado museum, show repairs made with whatever materials were available. Sinew, stitching, patches of different leather, modifications for specific terrain. These weren't romantic artifacts. They were tools that kept feet warm and dry in country where frostbite could cripple you for life. Steel traps from the fur trade, some still holding animal bones. The metal shows rust stains and impact marks from being reset thousands of times. The chains are worn thin from dragging through underbrush. The springs still work after more than a century, testament to craftsmanship that modern manufacturers rarely match. These artifacts whisper the truth that myths obscure. The mountain man life was about constant maintenance, endless vigilance, and the acceptance that everything you owned might be lost tomorrow to weather, thieves, or simple bad luck. But the myths persist because they serve a purpose that truth can't match. Americans need to believe that individual freedom is possible, that vast wilderness once existed, that men like themselves once lived completely outside society's rules and survived. The mountain men become symbols of American independence, rugged individualism, the pioneer spirit that supposedly built the nation. Politicians invoke their memory. Advertisers use their image to sell trucks and beer and outdoor gear. Hollywood keeps making movies about them, usually getting the details wrong but capturing something essential about the American dream of absolute freedom. What they represent isn't historical accuracy, it's psychological necessity. The belief that escape is possible, that the rules don't have to apply, that a person can disappear into the wilderness and reinvent themselves completely. And here's the thing. For about 25 years, that belief was actually true. From 1820 to 1845, a man really could walk away from civilization and create a completely different life. The western wilderness was vast enough to swallow anyone who wanted to disappear. The fur trade provided economic incentive. The Indian tribes were powerful enough to offer alternative social structures. For a brief moment in American history, the frontier was genuinely open, genuinely free, genuinely full of possibilities that existed nowhere else on Earth. Then it closed. Railroads, telegraphs, territorial governments, military forts, any cur. The infrastructure of civilization followed the trails the mountain men had blazed. The wilderness was surveyed, mapped, divided into property and political boundaries. The endless possibilities narrowed to choices available within society's framework. But the memory remains. The knowledge that it was once possible, that men like us once lived completely free. That's what the mountain men really left us. Not accurate history, but accurate hope. Proof that human beings can adapt to anything, survive anywhere, overcome any obstacle through courage and skill and the refusal to quit. They also left us a warning. Such freedom comes at a price that might be too high to pay. Isolation, violence, madness, early death, the cost of absolute independence, might be absolute responsibility for everything that happens to you. Modern Americans live with that contradiction. We want the freedom the mountain men found, but we're not willing to pay the price they paid. We want wilderness adventure with modern safety equipment. We want to test ourselves against nature, while carrying satellite phones and GPS devices. We want to experience the frontier while knowing we can return to civilization whenever we choose. Maybe that makes us smarter than the mountain men. Maybe it makes us weaker. Probably it just makes us different, products of a different time, facing different challenges. But the questions the mountain men embodied remain relevant. How much comfort are you willing to sacrifice for freedom? How much safety are you willing to risk for adventure? How much of your humanity are you willing to lose to find out what you're really made of? These aren't abstract, philosophical questions. They're practical choices that people make every day, choosing careers, relationships, lifestyles, homes. The mountain men took these questions to their logical extreme and showed us what the ultimate answers look like. Some found transcendence, others found destruction, most found both. Their legacy isn't the myths we've built around them or the symbols they've become. Their legacy is the proof that human beings are capable of more than they imagine, for better and for worse. They show us our potential for adaptation, survival, and achievement under impossible conditions. They also show us our capacity for violence, madness, and the gradual loss of everything that makes us human. The mountain men were Americans in their purest form, IMT, individuals who risked everything for the chance to be completely free. They succeeded, briefly, and then watched their success destroy itself. They gained the world and lost their souls, or lost the world and found their souls, or maybe just discovered that the two things aren't as different as we pretend. What remains is the echo of their lives bouncing off canyon walls and mountain peaks, getting fainter with each generation but never quite disappearing. The sound of men who refused to accept limits, who pushed beyond every boundary, who paid any price for the chance to live free. Whether we're brave enough to hear what they're telling us, plus whether we're wise enough to learn from their example, that remains to be seen. But the echoes are still there, waiting for anyone willing to listen. In every mountain trail, every rushing stream, every sunrise over wilderness that still exists because they mapped it first. The mountain men are gone, but their country remains, and sometimes, if you know how to listen, you can still hear their voices on the wind, telling us that freedom exists, that it's possible to live completely outside society's rules, that individual courage can overcome any obstacle, and whispering the price they paid to learn that lesson.